Each of us have our own private aspiration, and if you become involved with a spiritual community, that spiritual community gives voice to your private aspiration publicly. And, well, that's certainly very much what I feel, that, you know, I was looking for something, albeit very incoherently and blindly, and the order and Bhante's vision of the Dharma have given me an opportunity to work that through fully. And I'm sure that's the same for everybody. That's the nature of the Dharma. It's the nature of a personal invitation, so it's personal to each of us. But, you know, it works that out in a public context. So that's really what the roots of the FWDO are.
It was in 1975 that some members of the Western Buddhist Order and their young families left their London homes and went to live in a remote eastern county. Meanwhile, the Order's founder, the Venerable Sangharakshita, was living quietly in a nearby village. Sangharakshita had discovered he was a Buddhist when he was a teenager in wartime Britain. As a young conscript, he was later sent by the army to India, the land of the Buddha's birth. For 20 years, Sangharakshita had lived as a monk in India. Returning to Britain in the 1960s, he had set up an order of committed Buddhists, men and women who put the three jewels at the centre of their lives. The order was 7 years old, and though some of the early members had faded away, what it now represented was a totally new experience for Sangharakshita himself.
It was the first time in my life I'd found myself in a community of people for all of whom, all the members of that community, going for refuge to the Three Jewels was primary and everything else secondary and tertiary. That certainly hadn't happened in the East, even though I'd known individuals, for whom perhaps in practice going for refuge was primary, but certainly not a community of such individuals, such as one had in the order, at least had in the order after a few years.
Sangharakshita, known to disciples as Bhante, had now about 40 members in the order, and some of these were themselves setting up centres. Apart from the main one in London, there were other centres in Helsinki, Auckland, Christchurch, Glasgow and Brighton.
When I first went to Brighton, I didn't realise that I had it in me, in a way, to start a centre. But with Bhante's blessing, I just felt I had to go and do it, and it turned out all right.
Conveniently, just before work on the new centre began, a young man arrived expecting to find a red-robed mystic.
And it was a bit of a shock because he was wearing a sweater and Levi's, and he shook my hand. By the end of the puja, I knew definitively that I was going to devote my life to Buddhism.
When we were digging out the foundations and in the basement, we came across a little initiation vase. No idea how it got there because the place used to be a bakery. Underneath the centre, in number 19, there was quite a large shop that we got going, not just selling books, but selling all sorts of little knickknacks, tunkers, postcards, bits and pieces.
The main centre in the movement was still Pundarika, the converted piano factory at Archway. Sangharakshita wanted to breathe more fire into the centre, and so he invited Subhuti out for an Indian meal.
And over the thali, he suggested that I became chairman of the centre, of the council. You know, it hadn't been ordained for a month or two. I was absolutely blown over. But immediately, knew that's what yes, I wanted to do it. And I remember saying to Banti, well, yes, I would do it. I wanted to do it because I wanted to nail my colours to the mast. And Banti chortled and, just sort of really encouraged me.
At this point, other new order members came aboard, and amongst other improvements, introduced courses on Buddhism.
We enjoyed it a lot. Dave Mitra, Subhuti, Lekha Mitra. We just had this centre to run, so we had free hand, really. I mean, Banti kept an eye on us.
Subhuti had been ordained about 6 weeks before, and he and I in particular came together and mounted a lot more new classes at the centre.
At the centre of the team was the fiery friendship between Subhuti and Lekha Mitra.
Banti still calls us the terrible twins. We verbally fight like anything. But if we saw that the other person had a better idea than us, or his thinking was clearer, or, his point was more valid than us, we'd go along with it. Even though we struggled, we did all that we could not to go along with it first, but in the end we would concede and support the other.
People would usually have quite different impressions of the Archway Centre. Arnoma was not really a newcomer. She had already gone to Manju Vadra's classes in Cornwall.
It stood out. It was very, very colourful in the surroundings of grey. And when I went in, I remember there being bedspreads spread over all the couches and, again, very colourfully painted.
Bright, a bit crude sort of colours. And it looked like hippies to me. It looked like hippies. Middle class in the sense of fairly well-off background type hippies, which to my mind was the worst sort of people you avoided. I was an ex-hard drug-taking art student, which is quite a different grouping.
People that seemed to have something of whatever it was that Manju Vadra had. There was other people with the same something. It just struck me quite quickly.
Just felt I fitted in quite well, really. Yeah. Must have been trendy and hippie-ish myself. And the shrine was in the far corner, and there were curtains. I can't remember whether it was covered up or not, but I suspect it was covered. I suspect the curtains were going across.
So you didn't see the shrine until you'd been coming along to classes quite a long time, and once you'd gone on to the regulars class, you were introduced to a puja, and then the shrine curtain was open. So there was a bit of a build-up to what was behind the shrine. So I must say, when the cloth was pulled back, it was this very dark, again quite gloomy, not very well lit shrine, with a few very small Buddha figures on it, which seemed quite innocuous to me.
Namo Buddhaya.
Knowing when to introduce the newcomers to Buddhist worship or puja was a matter of experience. Aluka was kept away from something with a real zing until Subhuti suggested he could find out for himself.
He said, well, why don't you come along to a regulars class where we do pujas and chanting and things like that? And the sevenfold puja was like, I thought, wow, this is more, meaty.
Sangharakshita was at this time preparing a commentary on Shantideva's guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life and living quietly at Albemarle Cottage.
Yeah, they're quite nice and friendly to be against. If they were going into Swaffham, they'd say, is there anything you want? Yes. That might be about 13 or 14 years ago. Yeah, they had a van, I know. He built a boat or something while he was here. And I remember him telling me about Australia. Yes.
I just read, meditated, and went for walks. There was a little river, the River Nar, running just past the priory. And I remember nearly every day I used to walk past there and cross the little bridge, and I used to just stand in the middle of the bridge and look down on the flow of the water. And I remember one day in particular because I saw an otter, and of course there were very few otters surviving in that part of the country.
I think they had an organ when they were in there.
A local village hall was the setting for the Second Order Convention, which also celebrated Sangharakshita's 50th birthday. During the week, those who had been ordained for up to 8 years met up with many more new order members. In London, contractors had started working on buildings surrounding the Archway Centre, and its demolition was now imminent. But there were some other reasons for making changes.
We were determined to try to get out of the hippie mode, as it were. We felt that we were quite stuck in the alternative society, and we wanted to try to appeal to a wider audience. Because I know that people did feel that as soon as they walked into the centre that, you know, if you didn't have long hair and hadn't smoked dope, this wasn't the place for you. And we put a lot of effort into raising money and looking for a new centre. Lokamitra did the money raising, I did the looking for a new centre. We looked all over the place. I was particularly interested in Covent Garden. But eventually we found this old fire station, and it was an absolute wreck. But it was such a sort of big and impressive building, and we could have not only a centre there, but a large community. And that seemed to be just what we needed.
Converting a 5-storey ruin into the new centre was a colossal challenge. Subhuti set about communicating his enthusiasm and faith in the project to others. Once he'd found them.
Within about 3 months of meeting Subhuti, I was living next door to him in a squat in Balmore Street. And then he said to me, you know, we're going to build the London Buddhist Centre, sort of thing. Do you want to come and help? And I just said, well, yes, you know, you tell me when and I'm in.
When I did go and see it, I was horrified. I was really freaked out.
Yeah. Just seemed a lot of disrepair really all over the place. Derelict. Bleak. It'd been standing for about 5 years, I think, because it'd been used as a playground by kids, and I think there'd been, I don't know how many fires. And as you went up to the first floor, all the joists on the first floor had been burnt, and the floors were mainly up.
And the smell of piss and the smell of burnt rags, and it was so noisy and dirty and dark. And I just hated it, I really did.
A team of 6 Buddhists moved in, and using a derelict ground floor room to meditate in, started on what they thought would be a 6-month job.
All the windows had been taken out and put inside, and there was just corrugated iron nailed over the fronts of the window frames. Fortunately, it was a very hot summer, so at that point, when we first got in there, it didn't matter too much.
But when we started approaching winter, there wasn't any, we didn't have any hot water, we didn't have any gas. I think it was Christmas time when we actually got some electricity. And whenever it rained, you know, like it just, well, it was swept through the building.
We were just sleeping in sleeping bags on the floor, usually 2 to room, sometimes 3. We ate in one small room with an old sink. But I only noticed those things in retrospect. At the time, it seemed fine.
We did work, for a certain period of the day. We all ate together. Somebody would peel off and cook the meals. We'd study together in the evening. Subhuti would lead a study group. We'd do puja together. We'd meditate in the morning.
Over the next months, the community grew from 12 to 20. Bhante visited and gave it the name Sukhavati, meaning land of bliss, the land of the Buddha of the West, Amitabha. There were other attractions besides living and working together on this project.
There was also the sense of sharing in the creation of something that was going to be very important in the history of the FWBO and therefore perhaps in the history of Buddhism in Britain and in the West. Sukhavati represented a tremendous leap forward because hitherto we'd had a really relatively small FWBO centre in Archway. This was relatively, really quite big, and everybody was conscious of helping to create something which would constitute a very big step forward.
We never used to go out of the building, many of us. Just everything contained in one building. And the whole myth of transformation, very powerful. It was quite clear what we were doing. And there was a very, very positive atmosphere. I think that was one of our first discoveries, was just how positive and fruitful working together was.
Yeah, with tremendous energy, just unstoppable energy. I had more energy than I knew what to do with the whole time.
A Victorian architect, Norman Shaw, had built the Bethnal Green fire station upon a traditional pattern. For artists like Aluka and Chintamani, there was no clear way to create a sacred Buddhist space.
I decided that to produce a Western Buddha image, or an image that appealed to Western sensibilities, I decided that I ought to look at what I then understood to be the foundations of Western aesthetic sensibilities, which was Greek art, especially of the early classical period. So I went to Greece, quite simple. I went to Greece for a couple of months, taking sketchbooks with me, and went around all the sites, all the important sites, Delphi, Olympia, the Parthenon in Athens, and so on, and just drew figures, and these are some of the drawings I did. As in all my work at that time, I drew a lot of inspiration and stimulation from Aloka's work, because he was a much more experienced worker than I was. I think he was the first real artist, that I'd had contact with.
When Bhante had started the Friends, he had assumed all activities would follow Western fashion and be mixed. Then, from 1972, women and men began holding single-sex retreats, which they found supportive and enriching. Now, the men were discovering new levels of commitment and self-reliance from within a large full-time community and leading a semi-monastic lifestyle.
Originally, the intention was to have 2 communities in the building, a men's community on 1 floor or 2 floors and a women's community on the other 1 or 2 floors. But after we'd been there for about 5 or 6 months, the benefits of having all men together and only men together were just so obvious that I remember one evening in an order meeting we just spontaneously came to the conclusion that it would not be a good idea to have a women's community there as well as a men's community, and that the women should set up a community somewhere else. And I think it was the next day I rang Bhante, or I got a message to ring Bhante, and he said to me he'd been thinking about the community there, and he'd come to the conclusion that there shouldn't be a women's community on that premises, or there should only be a men's community on that premises, because the benefits seem to have been so great. So something was in the air.
The men's decision in no way changed the plans for the public centre itself. That would be a space run by both men and women.
Well, I think we felt rejected. I think we felt not wanted in the Sukhavati situation. And it was harder being a minority, harder being a smaller bunch of people, and feeling that there's so much more going on where the men were, so many more of them, and it was a bigger project, and feeling it was all a bit sort of second rate what we were up to.
It didn't feel a very supportive time for the movement at large. The women weren't really able to be that supportive of each other because we were all going through the same thing. I certainly didn't feel any support from the men at that time. It seemed to be a time when they really were trying to withdraw from women to the degree that, there was a phase where they simply just turned their heads. So it was, you're worse than being an untouchable, you're an unseeable, which, if you're not feeling very confident, was actually quite hard, which was very hard.
For men at Sukhavati, increasing confidence and independence from women did allow for some sexual experimentation to occur. But that meant confronting attitudes deeply rooted in the individual himself.
I'd related to women in a very, very neurotic way prior to that, as I realised, and I wanted to make the break. And so I had virtually nothing to do with women for, the whole 3 years or so. Virtually nothing to do with them at all. And, I had, it's not as if I didn't have an erotic outlet. I did. And I felt, sort of completely happy where I was.
Chintamani was not the first to tackle the theme of sexual relationships and couples. But by using his own experience of the struggle, he did produce a couple of personal and dramatic articles.
The way I'd lived my life had been very much dictated by my mother's psychology. Effectively, I had been in her world. Sexual contact with a man, to cut a long story short, you enter the man's world completely. You make the break. Tremendous amount of energy was released. Creative energy.
A lot more energy was released by his readers. The feeling of rejection experienced by women recurred during the Third Order Convention. However, the underlying dependence on men, or put another way, the assumption that men and women should do everything together, was firmly challenged.
I think the women are going to feel that they're being put to one side for some time. They're going to feel this, but I frankly think it's good for them. I really do believe that women can get it together in the same way that men can.
The emphasis here is on feel. That I think the women are going to feel pushed aside. In reality, they were not pushed aside. They were simply encouraged to be more independent, especially more independent emotionally of the men. Because I noticed that there was a tendency among at least some of the women to think that where the men were, that's where it was, that's where it happened, So that if you wanted to be where it was happening, where it was all at, you had to be with the men. If you were just with other women, you weren't with anything that was really happening or anything really worthwhile. So that is why I encouraged the women not to depend so much on the men and to try to create something for themselves. And I did that just by offering individual and collective encouragement, encouraging them to stand on their own feet and to feel that, when a number of women got together, especially women order members, they were just as much with whatever was going on as when they were with the men. They didn't have to be with the men in order to be where it was all happening.
Dharmadina, particularly, faced the new situation and, working with a few others, promoted an emerging women's wing of the FWBO, starting with a newsletter, Dakini, and then a women's council.
think it was that convention which sparked us off to go and do something together.
In 1974, New Zealand was a land waiting for the next guru to appear.
There were gurus visiting, as it were, every month, Indian, Tibetan, Zen, and so on. And there was this thing of people coming and giving a teaching, maybe getting some disciples, and then leaving immediately.
I wish you were here. We're just two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl, year after year.
We both went along together to the centre to learn meditation. We'd heard that there was an enlightened Englishman visiting.
We went on a ferry over to Waiheke Island for a Buddhist wedding. Akshobhya doing the celebrations, I think wearing a long kaftan. It really was a happy time. Lots of long hair, men and women, and you know, lovely people. Yeah. I don't think we quite knew where we were going. Had no idea what was going to come next.
During his winter 1974 to 75 visit, Bhante conducted 11 fresh ordinations. After his ordination, Achala started a centre in Wellington, whilst in Auckland, Akshobhya was at the head of the centre he had founded.
He always was a very important person in the mythology of the movement in New Zealand. Even when he wasn't terribly involved, people did look to him as the founder of the movement in New Zealand. And gradually he faded out of things. He wasn't really able to keep up. As he often used to say, the order that he joined is not the order that now exists. So he eventually dropped out. He liked to lie in the bath and chant mantras with his ears just under the water, which I thought was a bit odd. But I certainly learned to appreciate him a lot. I went and lived with him on Waiheke Island in the Sangavale land, and he did blow away any pseudo-spirituality that I had. He was such a down-to-earth character. Udaya actually, when he was a Mitra, started the first men's community in Auckland, in New Zealand. It was a very beautiful, big, rambling house and in a really lovely part of Auckland, quite near the sea. It belonged to Priyananda's grandfather, and a number of us moved in, about 7 or 8 of us moved in. And that was my first true community, and it was a very magical time. There was an orchard out the back. Somebody in the basement had a flotation tank, and it was just very much the last flowering of hippiedom, I suppose. Yeah, it was great.
Doing 7 classes a week in North London had taken a toll on the newly ordained Devamitra, so he went to live in the country. But within a year, he was keen to get back to a city to start a centre.
I wanted to go out and give of myself. And I think this has asserted itself more and more the longer I stayed in Norfolk, until I eventually did a solitary retreat at the end of that year and finally decided that I was just going to have to plunge in again, and decided to move to Norwich to set up the centre there, which I did. I managed to get a small group of men friends around me quite quickly. And that was, it just, it fed my own inspiration and enthusiasm. and, you know, I suppose fed my drive to, you know, push the project further.
The Glasgow Buddhist Centre was still using premises in Bath Street when a lot of young energy erupted.
And when I first went up there, Vajradhaka was the chairperson, and then we did agree that I would take over being the chairperson. There were very, very few women involved, which seemed to have been the history of Glasgow, and I found that quite difficult. So, yeah, I was a woman, I was English, and I was in a predominantly male Sangha, which I didn't find that easy, as you might imagine. I mean, it's not that people were horrible to me, but there was definitely a tension there. And in many ways, I felt they would be better off on their own.
Even the tempo changed, and mainly due to the young Dhammacharis that were there at the time. Particularly Uttara and Ajita. They had quite strong gang background. Dyed hair and spiky hair and sometimes ripped t-shirts and safety pins. They would put this down to their skillful means. Although, to a certain extent, I think it wasn't just skillful means, it was them liberating themselves from notions of conventionality too.
Tell you what, is a life successful or is a life a failure? This is a successful life. He's got a lot to be proud of. Here we are, so many people who have a feeling, a positive feeling and friendship for him. I think that Ajita's legacy, in a way, will never disappear. And why? Because Ajita left a legacy of human beings influenced by him. Human beings who, in their own heart, are influenced by him. They have taken up the torch of the Dharma. And it was him, in a sense, him who gave them that torch, and they will pass it on to other human beings in a way Ajita's legacy will never die out. I hope I die the same. I hope I die the same. I trust I'll die the same, but you can never tell.
Every Monday morning we'd have a house meeting, and there'd be Attila would be the realist, who'd be going, you know, oh God, you know, we're never going to finish this, and there's no way we can do that. And then Subhuti would be the totally idealist and saying, oh yes, it's fantastic, you know, we're going to be able to finish this in 2 weeks' time. And Attila would hang his head, and so somewhere in the middle was what was reality, really, what was truth.
Subhuti and his team had first been assigned the fire station when they assured the Greater London Council they had all they needed to finish the job, even if it meant using plastic pipe and Jubilee clips to do the plumbing.
Apparently they worked it out on the back of the fag packet that it was going to, you know, take something like 15,000 or something.
I think it was either 10 or 15,000 pounds we thought we needed, or I thought we needed, and 6 months' work by a team of 12 or something like that, which is absolutely ridiculous. As Banti has said, it's a good thing we didn't know. But actually it did in the end cost £250,000.
Subhuti went away, and while he was away, I discovered all sorts of things. As we began to uncover to strip ceilings down and look behind the damp, it was obviously a lot worse than we thought it was, and it wasn't just damp rot, it was dry rot.
To eradicate the fungus, all infected timber, down from the roof and upper stories, had to be stripped out. Some kind friends were able to provide a rickety scaffold for the purpose.
They had this scaffold that was Mickey Mouse. The surveyor came along, and he was just horrified, really.
The next stage was applying a chemical treatment, which was no special treat.
And Punya spent weeks and weeks in this kind of Amy Johnson type headgear, spraying this terribly poisonous stuff into all these holes.
Punya, like others, applied himself with determination and stamina, but without benefit of any previous experience.
There weren't any builders there,
and I was at least half a builder, having done that sort of thing a bit.
My building experience has been as a carpenter and joiner, and I'd watch people do things.
Attila had seen plastering. He taught me, so I was now the plasterer, and I'd put up tons and tons and tons of plaster.
We had all sorts of people in Sukhavathi at that time who would never be in a community these days. I think really we were desperate for people to join Sukhavathi and actually work on the building, so we weren't so bothered about their spiritual commitment, and it was quite chaotic and all over the place really.
With extreme naivety, I at any rate used to believe that what we were doing was so positive and the general atmosphere was so good that we could take on more or less anybody and they would be transformed. Alas, it wasn't true. And we did have quite a number of people who clearly needed much more help, not just spiritually, probably psychologically, than we were able to give them. We didn't have time, but more than that, we didn't have experience. We had quite a number of people with fairly severe mental difficulties. And so we began to realise that not everybody is eligible for a community. If you have too many people who are not really able to be in the community, it ceases to be a community. And we began to have a more elaborate and careful vetting system. We'd expect them to come and work with us a bit beforehand. But we certainly saw that a community needs conscious building. We had to make sure that it wasn't just work, not just meditation and puja, that we had to have fun together. And so we used to have social evenings from time to time.
Anyone with any skills or non-skills would contribute by singing, playing harmonica.
They went to mow a meadow. Only 3 men, 2 men, 1 man and his dog went to mow a meadow. Jump, Alex. 5 men went to mow. Went to mow a meadow. 5 men, 4 men, 3 men, 2 men, 1 man and his dog went to mow a meadow.
Make it snap. There was just a tremendous amount of fun around Subhuti, apart from the seriously organising thing. So a mixture of the two is very, very rare in there.
I remember somebody saying to us that he'd been in Bethnal Green for all his life, and suddenly he couldn't understand why there were so many people with a gleam in their eye walking about. He couldn't work out what was going on. He felt something had changed. Then he realised that this was Buddhist centre and that these people were from that centre.
Being there, I felt, was a really good time to experience myself, experience what it was like to give myself to a men-only situation, and that did bring its rewards. And I think one of the rewards is a certain degree of contentment.
The FWBO retreats for the last decade had been set up in all sorts of rented premises. But in 1976, Bunty and a friend, Vajrakumara, who built boats, bought a country house near a river, and the first men's retreat centre was launched. Bunty gathered about him a small community to run retreats and provide some secretarial help. He could now assume, if he wished, the role of a Norfolk country gentleman. However, he also undertook the role of public speaker for the Sutra of Golden Light series of talks, his first in 4 years, in romantic Hampstead in North London.
It was quite magical. It was for a series of 8 weeks. Every week, I think maybe 50 of us would just walk across the heath in the early evening. It was like entering another realm, really, that we'd enter listening to the sutra, and then you'd come back and you'd have the lights of London, or this sense of, the possibility of transforming the world, really, vision of what was possible, really. It was bigger than just living in these squats in Balmoor Street.
then the area got seedier and seedier and local kids rougher and rougher. I remember on November the 5th, it was probably 1976, during meditational puja, in one moment, just about every single window of the upstairs shrine room was broken.
And Subhuti just opened his eyes and said, okay, move away from the windows. And we just moved away from the windows and carried on.
And we had thefts, threats from local kids. And it did get quite unpleasant. We had to work very hard to keep the atmosphere in the centre positive, as opposed to the general sort of atmosphere in the surrounding area.
Bhante had said, can you go down there and see if you can shake it up a bit?
For a year, Nagabodhi ran classes for the 5 or 6 regulars, whilst surrounded by gnomes and stockbrokers.
A very established little cosy family suburbia Sangha. I mean, I really was thinking we're not going anywhere. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was lying down and I was sort of falling asleep, and I just had this kind of semi-daydream, semi-night dream of that house full of people. Yeah, just some of them were people I knew, friends of mine, and some of them were people I didn't know. It was just full of people doing things, living together. And I sort of woke up and I thought, this is stupid. Of course we can do it. I just felt totally convinced. I thought, I can't do it on my own. I need to find a team to help me.
And so there were 4 of us. There was Nagabodhi, Padmaraja, Jayatipala and I. And I think quite quickly, we had the sense that we would be a very good team. And we complemented one another very well. And we were all good meditation teachers. There'd been classes on a Wednesday night for quite a long time, and word very quickly spread, and we went from very, very few people indeed to 30, 40, 60.
At a centre, you had to create lots of space for people to get to know each other, and to create the situations in which they could get to know each other well. So obviously you had your weekend retreats, and you had benefit dinners, you had jumble sales. We decorated the house 2 or 3 times, which brought people in.
We'd have a big meeting, we'd have a gathering of the clans, and we'd just talk through with everyone who was engaged with the centre really, what we were trying to do next. We'd take ideas, and it felt like a very strong cooperative effort amongst an increasing number of people.
The energy and enterprise could be transmuted into funds. And during the hottest summer on record, several £1,000s were raised through carpentry, gardening, house removals, and work at the BBC. Meanwhile in Brighton, a team from the centre took over running a vegetarian restaurant. In Norwich, a similar project called Rainbow was begun by Kulananda and Samatar.
He and I and other friends had become vegetarians during our period of time at university. So in a way, one of the obvious choices was to start a vegetarian restaurant. We did have rather vague ideas of living communally in the countryside and having this business in Norwich.
In the centre of the city, Deva Mitra and friends were moving into much larger premises.
There was quite a momentum building up very quickly actually, so that by the end of December there were six of us had come together to form a men's community. It meant that we had an opportunity to just be with each other, and I think that we were able therefore to have a very good basis for the development of our friendships. Bhadrakula was a closed men's community, and that was quite a step forward, I think, for the movement. I think it was a bit of a contentious issue at the time too.
At that time I had really talked myself into the fact that I would not live with women, that it would not work. I just thought it would just be too emotional and none of us strong enough to provide any kind of direction.
Whilst she did not at first relish single-sex situations, she went on a large women's retreat at Aryatara.
just remember us all being quite happy together, and it felt like quite an air of excitement, and it was up to us that we could create what we wanted to do.
In the fair garden blooms the flower halo, circling round it is the Persian bee. Their meeting and their parting mark the change of time. Dear flowers,
As a result of the retreat, Marlene, some Mitras and Shrimala from Norfolk inspired each other with the prospect of creating more facilities for women.
I had been for some time considering how to move away from the nuclear family, basically. I was, yes, very much on my own as a Dharmacharini up in Norfolk. Thought, it'd just be great if somebody else, another Dharmacharini, moved up there. So I was very encouraging. And then somehow the talk moved on to, maybe sometime there could be a retreat centre up there. Well, I went off back to Norfolk and babies.
When Marlene and Shrimala came together during the period of looking for a property, they found there were difficult decisions to be made about the nature of the project, whether to have a community or a retreat centre, and, by no means least, where the two small girls should go during retreats.
I was wondering about it myself. Then to me it seemed as though it actually wouldn't be appropriate to have children in a retreat centre. We just had to sort of look at it, face the situation, and I found it very painful. I really, really wanted to do something to move from the situation I was in. In the end, I was glad that I wasn't involved in the project.
Shrimala moved into Norwich, whilst Marlene with 3 Mitras moved to a rundown farm, now again in private hands, but which in June 1977 became the first women's retreat centre in the movement.
I wasn't particularly happy living in the city. I think we all fell in love with it because it was charming and slightly unloved, and it had potential, which are words which we came to hear quite a lot over the next 2 or 3 years.
And there was a bowl to match. Right. Well, I'm afraid I don't know where the bowl is at the moment.
I remember I had a tent and I set it up in this meadow, which was rather wild at that point, and I had my bed and table and furniture all in this tent until that sprang a rather serious leak. It did give me a sense, well, we can do it. We were doing it ourselves. And the early period I found very enjoyable, just doing up the house. Prabha and I knocked down a wall because we wanted to extend the kitchen dining room area. And just the confidence with which she said, well, we're just going to knock down this wall and we've got to put up a cross beam, I forget the name of it, JCB or something, across the top.
I do. And we had
Amongst the 6 acres of nettles, there were the remains of greenhouses, chicken coops and barns.
We just thought, well, we'll just be able to convert them, and we hadn't taken into account, just really practical things like the fact that we hadn't got any money. We hadn't got a beam, we hadn't got enough tools, nobody had a car at the time.
We had neither money nor people, but we hadn't quite sussed that at that point. We were all quite excited, very naive, and just all actually really enjoying each other's company in those early days. And I think we did quite a lot of sunbathing in the afternoon and worked well into the evening. we made it very sort of pleasant for us. And it was great fun right at the very beginning. But that didn't last very long, unfortunately.
Just at the time when a lack of basic resources was hampering the Women's Retreat Centre, work on the New London Centre was abandoned through lack of funds. How they met this challenge remains to be told, but for a whole year the men went out to work to earn enough to keep the community afloat.
It was the middle period which was hardest, after the initial rush had subsided, and it seemed that we were really not going to get the money from anywhere. So I started going out to work with 4 or 5 others doing building work, which seemed to, it was quite a blow, because we just seemed then to be treading water.
Dreaming and thinking as the autumn ends, I, like the swallow, must prepare for flight, must leave deep-rooted here my ancient friends, and go where night is day, and day is night. Brief though my stay, I shall be thinking ever of this quiet spot beside the sluggish river. Thinking and dreaming, in this quiet spot, summer and winter, I shall end my days, till like the rose I am remembered not, and life has vanished with the sunset rays. Then, among silver lakes and golden mountains, the newborn lotus smiles beside the crystal fountains.